Hello, welcome to this video on Krashen's 5 hypotheses of second language acquisition. Stephen Krashen is a well-known linguist and researcher in the field of second language acquisition, and his 5 hypotheses have become an important framework for understanding how people learn a second language. Krashen believed that language acquisition does not require extensive use of conscious grammatical rules. For Krashen, acquisition requires just meaningful interaction in the target language and natural communication. Krashen's theory, this theory of second language acquisition, consists of 5 main hypotheses. The first one is acquisition learning. This hypothesis states that there are 2 different ways of acquiring a second language, through acquisition and through learning. Acquisition is the natural and unconscious way of acquiring a language, similar to how a child learns their first language. It is the process of using language in real-life situations and picking up on the meaning and grammar through context and repetition. It is not a conscious effort, and the learner is not aware of the grammatical rules they are picking up. So here, language acquirers are not consciously aware of the grammatical rules of the language, but rather develop a feel for correctness. And there is learning, on the other hand. Learning is more formal and conscious, like studying grammar rules in a classroom setting. It is the process of being taught the rules and structure of a language through explicit instruction. The learner is aware of the rules they are learning and can apply them in a controlled setting. Language learning refers to the conscious knowledge of a second language. Knowing the rules, being aware of them, and being able to talk about them. Krashen argues that acquisition is more important than learning. So for Krashen, acquisition is more important than learning in order to develop a communicative competence in a second language. And the second hypothesis is the input hypothesis. This hypothesis states that language acquisition is driven by the input that the learner receives. In other words, the more input or language that a learner receives that is just beyond the current level of understanding, and this is important, it should be just beyond the current level of understanding. So the more they will acquire, this is often referred to as comprehensible input. The input hypothesis is based on the idea that language acquisition is a natural process that happens when the learner is exposed to language that is comprehensible to them. So the learner progresses along the natural order when he receives second language input that is one step beyond his current stage of linguistic competence. The third hypothesis is the natural order hypothesis. This hypothesis states that the acquisition of grammatical structures follows a natural order, and that this order is the same for all learners regardless of the language they are learning. This natural order is based on the idea that certain structures are acquired before others, and that this order is predictable. So this hypothesis states that the acquisition of grammatical structures follows a natural order which is predictable. Krashen rejects grammatical sequencing or organization. He rejects organization when the goal is language acquisition. The natural order hypothesis suggests that certain grammatical structures are acquired in a specific order regardless of the language being learned. For example, it suggests that the acquisition of the verb tenses such as the past tense and the future tense, simple past versus simple future, will come before the acquisition of more complex structures such as the subjunctive mood. The fourth hypothesis is the monitor hypothesis. This hypothesis states that language learners have an internal monitor that checks and corrects their language use. This monitor can be used for editing and for self-correction, but is not always used, and it is not always used correctly. It is more likely to be used when the learner is paying attention to form, and when the learner has enough time to think, and when the learner is learning sitting. This monitor is a conscious process that is used for editing and self-correction, and it is based on the knowledge of the grammar and vocabulary that the learner has acquired. So the monitor function is the practical result of the learned grammar. There is something in our minds like a regulator that edits and corrects and controls everything we want to utter before we produce it. For the monitor to take place, three conditions are to be met. The first condition is sufficient time, no pressure, and the focus on the form. We want to produce well-formed sentences. And the third condition is knowledge of the rule. If we don't know the rules, we cannot monitor. The fifth and the final hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. It states that our emotional state can affect our ability to acquire a second language. Factors such as anxiety, motivation, and self-esteem can raise or lower what Krashen calls the affective filter, which can either facilitate or inhibit language acquisition. So, low motivation, low self-esteem can combine to raise the affective filter and form a mental block that prevents comprehensible input from being used for acquisition. In other words, when the filter is up, it impedes language acquisition. The affective filter hypothesis posits that our emotional state can affect our ability to acquire a second language. So those are Krashen's 5 hypotheses of second language acquisition. While they are not universally accepted, they have had a significant impact on the field of second language acquisition and continue to be an important framework for understanding how people learn a second language.